chess genius, Cold War hero, 9/11 supporter. This is the story of Bobby Fischer, the first and only American to win the World Chess Championship. Fischer demonstrated exceptional talent and enthusiasm for chess from an early age, transforming his status from an unknown individual to that of a grandmaster. However, as the years passed by, Fischer's life took an unbelievable turn, leaving the world wondering what could have possibly happened to the once celebrated chess prodigy. How did a young man who became a grandmaster at 15 and went on to defeat the Soviet champion at 29 spiral down a path of paranoia and controversy? This is the tragic downfall of Bobby Fischer, the chess genius who conquered the world of chess only to lose himself. Born on March 9th of 1943 in Chicago, Illinois, Bobby had a rough upbringing. His mother, Regina Wender, was married to Hans Gerhard Fischer, a famous German biophysicist. However, he was denied entry into the United States because of his German citizenship. This led to many believing that he was the illegitimate son of the famous Hungarian scientist Paul Nemenyi, whom Bobby's mother had an affair with. By 1945, Regina's relationship with her husband Hans Gerhard soured, which led to him abandoning her. With no support, Regina was forced to raise her newborn son Bobby and daughter Joan as a single mother. During the time of his birth, Regina was virtually homeless. She had to take multiple jobs to support Bobby and his sister Joan. At just 6 years old, Bobby and Joan started playing chess from a set that he bought from a candy store. While his sister lost interest rather quickly, Bobby was hooked. With no one else to play against him, he started playing games against himself. One day, Bobby caught the attention of Carmine Nigro, the president of the Brooklyn Chess Club. Impressed by Bobby's natural talent, Nigro decided to mentor him. Bobby would later reflect on this, saying, "Mr. Nigro was possibly not the best player in the world, but he was a very good teacher. Meeting him was probably a decisive factor in my going ahead with chess." At 13, Fischer would taste his first major success as he won the US Junior Championship. The next year, he went on to win the US Championship. Bobby Fischer was now crowned with the title of Grandmaster at just the age of 15, which was never heard of before. It was around this time that Fischer announced himself as a true once-in-a-generation talent with his game against international master Donald Byrne. In the match, Bobby made the daring move of sacrificing his queen to go on an all-out attack against Byrne, winning the match, which boosted his popularity in the club. There was no doubt that Bobby Fischer was simply the best, most prodigious player America had ever produced on the chessboard. And now, the young prodigy was about to get the shot of his life, facing the Soviet grandmasters who had dominated the game for decades. But little did he know that the very game that fueled his success would eventually consume him. After facing a long list of Soviet grandmasters from Tigran Petrosian, Vasily Smyslov, and Mikhail Tal, Bobby was ready to face Boris Spassky in the 1972 World Championship in Reykjavik. Nonetheless, it was a rocky start for Bobby. He bizarrely lost the first 2 games and refused to play the next match until it was held away from the cameras. At this point, most people thought it was all over for Bobby, but his opponent Boris Spassky had other plans. He didn't want to win by default, so he agreed to Bobby's demands to move the game to the next back room with no cameras that were bothering him. This was a serious blunder by Spassky, as Bobby went on to win 7 out of the next 19 games with 11 draws, making him the 11th World Chess Champion. The Soviets couldn't believe that Spassky had lost and started suspecting the CIA for alleged poisoning of Spassky's orange juice. However, no such poisoning was needed, because Bobby was simply that exceptional. The match was held at the peak of the US-Soviet Cold War, so winning against the mighty Soviets in their own game was seen by many as a symbolic victory of democracy over communism. He also started to appear in a number of TV shows and single-handedly made chess a mainstream phenomenon that could captivate audiences like any other sport. Harold C. Schonberg, who reported on the Reykjavik match, wrote in his 1973 book Grandmasters of Chess, quote, "It was Bobby Fischer who had, single-handedly, made the world recognize that chess on its highest level was as competitive as football, as thrilling as a duel to the death, as aesthetically satisfying as a fine work of art, as intellectually demanding as any form of human activity." End quote. However, Bobby's glory days were incredibly short-lived. After the 1972 victory over Boris Spassky, the next challenge of Fischer was to defend his title against the Soviet Grandmaster Anatoly Karpov. However, Fischer was not impressed with the chess championship format. During the early 1980s, the tournament was held as a 24-game match, and the first player to get 12.5 points was declared the winner. But in the case of a tie, at 12-12, the prize money would be split between the players along with the reigning champion keeping the title. To Fischer, this made no sense. He argued that once a player got a decent lead, they could just play defensively, go for draw after draw, and slowly but surely win the championship. So he pleaded with the committee to change the format, but his request fell on deaf ears, and the committee vetoed his request. With the demands denied, the stubborn genius from Brooklyn did the unthinkable. He refused to defend his title against Anatoly Karpov. This shocking decision marked the start of a self-imposed 20-year exile from competitive chess. He became a drifter, spending time in the LA area while making connections with the now infamous Worldwide Church of God. To make things worse, he was arrested in Pasadena for an alleged robbery case. He ended up spending 48 hours in jail and wrote a book, I Was Tortured in the Pasadena Jailhouse. As time went on, Fischer slowly lost his grip on reality, showing something was seriously going wrong with him. Aside from a brief cameo in 1977 where he defeated a computer program, Greenblatt at MIT, Fischer disappeared from the game that he once ruled like a king. However, the King of Chess would eventually return to the game for the much-anticipated revenge match of the 20th century against his old rival, Boris Spassky. But there was one massive problem. The match was held in Yugoslavia at a time when the nation was completely under United Nations sanctions, including commercial activities. Despite warnings from the US government that his participation would violate the sanctions, Fischer went ahead with the match. He defeated Spassky one more time and proclaimed himself as the undefeated world champion. This brazen act made Fischer a wanted man back home in the States, and he knew he faced potential arrest if he ever returned to American soil. So, he decided to start spending the remainder of the 90s drifting, but this time in Europe. However, this did not stop Fischer from making some of the most controversial statements of the century. Just hours after the horrific 9/11 terrorist attacks, Fischer called it wonderful news. He doubled down, stating, quote, "I applaud the act. Look, nobody gets that the US and Israel have been slaughtering the Palestinians for years." End quote. The US Chess Federation swiftly passed a motion to revoke Fischer's membership in the organization to his statements praising the 9/11 attacks. But Fischer's hateful rhetoric didn't just stop there. He outrageously advocated for the US military to take over the government, shut down all synagogues, arrest all Jewish people, and execute hundreds of thousands of Jewish ringleaders. He denied the Holocaust despite being a Jew himself and described the United States as nothing but a country run by dirty, hook-nosed Jewish bastards. From 1999 to 2006, Fischer's main way of communicating with the public was through radio interviews and broadcasts. He did at least 34 of these, mostly on radio stations in the Philippines, but also in other countries like Hungary, Russia, and Colombia. In a radio interview in Budapest, Fischer described himself as the victim of a Jewish conspiracy. There are accounts of Fischer confronting a Jewish chess opponent, telling him that he was reading an interesting book. When asked what book it was, his response, Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf. After the controversial 1992 match against Spassky, Bobby became a fugitive, and he slid into obscurity for quite a while. The once celebrated chess icon took up a living in Budapest and lived the next few years wandering in the streets. During this time, it's believed that Fischer had a romantic relationship with a Hungarian chess player, Zita Rajszányi, despite their 30-year age gap. Eventually, Fischer found his way to the Philippines and lived with his old friend and former second, the Filipino grandmaster Eugene Torre. But his life of cloak and dagger only continued from there. In 2004, Japanese authorities detained Fischer when he tried to fly to Manila using what he thought was a valid passport. Despite the arrest warrant back in the States, Bobby believed that the travel documents were legit. However, the Japanese weren't so convinced, and they held him in custody for over 2 weeks before transferring him to another facility. While locked up, Fischer married the president of the Japanese Chess Association, Miyoko Watai, whom he had been living with since 2000. However, time was ticking for Bobby, and he had to do something before getting deported back to the US. So, Fischer did what any reasonable man would do. He wrote a letter to the government of Iceland requesting citizenship, which they would initially decline. In a wild turn of events, Iceland ended up granting him an alien's passport at first, before giving Fischer full citizenship a few months later for humanitarian reasons. After finally landing in Reykjavik, Bobby gave one last press conference and went into reclusion for the remainder of his life, avoiding anyone who tried to approach him. Toward the end of his life, Fischer's mind seemed disturbed. He claimed the belongings of his that were sold in the US without permission were worth hundreds of millions, even billions of dollars. In 2006, he also accused a Swiss bank of closing one of his accounts against his wishes. However, his remarkable yet paranoid, disturbed life finally came to an end on January 17, 2008, due to kidney failure. He was 64 at the time of his death, just like the number of squares on a chessboard. He was laid to rest in a small Christian cemetery in Iceland in the presence of his wife, Miyoko Watai, and his close associates. But even in death, controversy followed the chess genius. His death kicked off all sorts of legal disputes over his remaining property and assets. The courts of Iceland eventually ruled that Watai had officially married Fischer back in 2004, making her entitled to inherit his estate. After his death, many psychologists speculated whether Bobby suffered from conditions like Asperger's syndrome or even schizophrenia. So they took the case and concluded that Bobby was suffering from a rare case of paranoid personality disorder. Some experts theorized that Bobby may have inherited mental illnesses from his biological father, Paul Nemenyi, who also reportedly battled psychology issues. Nevertheless, the chess genius spent the remainder of his final years in peace of the lands where he first won the World Chess Championship. Looking back, the Grandmaster Yasir Seirawan, who had known Fischer for a while, wrote, quote, "After September 23, 1912, I threw most of what I'd ever read about Bobby out of my head. Sheer garbage. Bobby is the most misunderstood, misquoted celebrity walking the face of the earth." End quote. If you liked the video, make sure to subscribe to our channel so that you don't miss more amazing content. And if you have any suggestions, feel free to share the thoughts down in the comment section. But until then, see you next time.